welcome everyone to the Rise of Privacy Tech Virtual Summit. I'm so grateful for you guys for joining us today. We have our second fireside chat of the morning. We will be talking about the future of privacy tech, or privacy tech 2.0. Mickey and Alan earlier talked about some of the developments, privacy engineering, some of the data protection laws that led up to the emerging privacy tech landscape today. And now we pick up where they left off, and we're talking about where do we go from here? Where can we take this? Where should we take this emerging landscape? And with me today, we have two amazing speakers. We have Leah Kistner, who is the head of privacy engineering at Twitter and has had a long, very illustrious career in privacy engineering, having worked at Apple and Google, and even, if I remember correctly, consulted at Zoom during this time last year when they were taking on some of the bigger challenges in privacy and security. And of course, we also have Kieran, did I say your last name correctly?
Yes.
Awesome. Who is the CEO of Ethica and a repeat entrepreneur. And it's Ethica, as you know, is one of the emerging and leading privacy tech startups that are building to solve for some of our privacy problems today. So I'm really excited that you two are joining us here to share your thoughts about where we should be taking this landscape moving forward. I want to share quickly that we do have a stage chat, and so if folks want to share questions, comments, you're free to do that. I will be keeping an eye on that and taking questions as we go. Leah and Killian, if you have anything in addition to add, and if you want to say hello to everyone, please do. We'd love to hear about you, and welcome to the Rise of Privacy Tech Virtual Summit.
Hi, I'm Leah. For all of you, my pronouns are they, them. And like Lorda said, I've done a bunch of privacy engineering, but my background is actually in crypto. My PhD is in crypto. I designed and built a lot of Google's infrastructure security back in the day, and did a lot of things that security people tend to think are weird, often meaning there is a human involved in this somewhere. A lot of that ended up being what we would now call the field of privacy engineering. Some of that ended up being what we would call health or trust and safety, and part of that field. So I think that all of these things are very deeply interconnected. They're very much aimed at how we build products and systems that respect the people who use them and the people who are affected by them. So all of these fields have extremely fuzzy boundaries, and you can't do any of them well without really deeply considering all of them and the actual humans that are involved.
I completely agree with Leah as a starting point, but aside from that, so I'm Killian, as Lourdes kindly said. I'm the founder and CEO at Ethica. So our role in this space is that we're trying to build tools that assist particularly developers and engineers that are trying to solve the problems of respectful technology. Because our view, much as Leah espoused, is that these problems are solved from an engineering standpoint. But today, a lot of the effort that has gone in over the last 2 decades is very much focused on security rather than maybe just respect or privacy design, right? So we're very focused on that part of things. So I'm very excited to talk to you both today.
And likewise. So I want to start off with some of the trends that we're seeing in the privacy tech landscape. We're seeing funding pour into it. There are now 964 startups being listed on Crunchbase as self-proclaimed privacy companies. There's been about 4.9 billion of capital poured into the privacy space in the last decade, if Crunchbase is to be believed. And we've seen some of those announcements through TechCrunch and other publications about these funding rounds. We see more B2B startups getting funded than B2C, and we see some, most of them geared towards or take advantage of GDPR and CCPA and other privacy and data protection laws. So we're seeing some of those trends. Leah, as a longtime privacy engineering practitioner, what are some of the trends and problems that you're what are some of the privacy tech trends that you're seeing in your on the ground as a practitioner? And feel free to share insights that you may have, not just from your own experience, but from other privacy engineering colleagues that you have. I know that you also have, you lead PEPR and organize PEPR, so we'd love to hear about some of those insights and trends that you're seeing.
So first off, let me explain PEPR for all of you who haven't been yet. PEPR, P-E-P-R, is the Privacy Engineering Practice and Respect Conference. Lori Craner, who runs SciLab and the new center now at Carnegie Mellon University, and I started it. We've now run it 3 times. It is literally the only privacy engineering practitioners conference that exists. So if you want to be in privacy engineering, that is the place to be. You just missed it for this year. Videos will be online. That's what the logo looks like. So that's a good place to share what's going on and learn how other people have been doing things, and which things are a lot trickier than they actually look, and how people have been tackling them. So some of the privacy tech trends I've seen over time, like I apparently have terrified a whole bunch of the vendors on the IPP vendor floor by going around and asking a lot of questions. And I've had the good luck to talk to a very large number of startups. And but I also talk to a lot of people who are running the privacy engineering teams. And I ran privacy engineering at Google. I ran it at a startup. I run it at Twitter now. So got a little bit of background on this, but the first generation of privacy tech was very compliance oriented, and it was very much like, look, a data map. And I started building this stuff over a decade ago. So when I look at that, I say, oh, look, you made a map. What you have now made is an infinite queue of annoying things to do. You haven't actually solved your problem. What you did is you made your problem visible, which is great. That is a useful thing, but it doesn't solve your problem. And so that tech is just not, to me, it's not that useful, because an infinite queue of things to annoy the engineers with is a good way to just make everybody sad and never actually get your system into a good place. What we're starting to see now, and I'm very excited about this, is tech that's much more focused on actually solving problems. Things like, I would like to make sure that my interns don't have fingers in my user data. I would like to make sure the data actually gets deleted, and not just in the way that people tend to look at it, where they look at it and they're like, look, it's my primary data store. I have removed the row, or I removed the ID corresponding to Killian's data, and therefore we are done, as opposed to not realizing that you have to do all of the downstream copies, all of the derived data. You need to think about things like, are your machine learning models anonymous? Most of them are not anonymous. We have seen good real world attacks against them. So we're starting to see more of this, and it's super, super exciting. And hopefully I won't just have to go around and ask awkward questions about it now.
Thank you for that, Leah. Killian, as a founder who's building in the space, what are some of the trends that you're responding to and solving for and building for? We'd love to hear more about what you guys, I think, are doing, and some of the, based on the market research and the trends that you're seeing in privacy tech, which ones are you trying to tackle and build for?
Right, absolutely. Well, to echo what Leah has said, which is a really important point, is that the sort of 2 life phases in privacy, right? There's what's been happening to now, I think, and the sort of sea change that's occurring. So that is to say that up until now, it's been very much about, I think, sort of GRC compliance band-aids, right? So give me a data map, allow me to delete a user, which is a very valuable thing. You should be able to do this, and we need to, because our systems didn't do it before, so that's a given. But these are the low-hanging fruit in privacy, right? They're the baseline things, the hygiene factors that any business should be able to do anyway. What we should ask ourselves, right, is why is it that we don't know where data is in our organization? Why is it that we weren't able to delete information? And how do we enforce those constraints on systems in the future? They're much more interesting questions, and they start much further back in the software development lifecycle, right? They start with when you design and build a system in the first place. How do you consider these things as conditions or features of the product? And so that is to say that while we do things like delete users' information and generate data maps, what Ethica has been focused on for the last 2.5 years are sets of tools that are really intended for use by software engineers and data engineers as they're building systems, so that they can hopefully bake greater degrees of respect into the products they ship, rather than tack on band-aids after the fact. So like functionally, that means things like identifying what services do in a microservices organization. So what do those components or fragments of a system do? How do they behave? And as Leah said, how could you then enforce constraints, like make sure they can only see certain types of data for certain business conditions, that kind of thing.
And can I add on to that? Because so true. And one of the things that is wildly underappreciated is that the things that we want to do for security and privacy reasons are very much the same things you want to do in order to keep your system up. So for example, there are two reasons why you want to control who has access to a particular piece of storage or a particular service. One of those is, yes, we want to cut down the security risk. We want to govern our data appropriately. One of them is dependency control. This is how you prevent the interns from accidentally taking down your system with a MapReduce, right? Like, this is very much part of how a system operates appropriately, and by helping build this into how we develop, design, and deploy and debug, then that becomes just part of how the system works, and it works better for everybody.
Completely, Leah. And I think we've made good progress on this in security over the last sort of decade. And privacy is probably slightly catching up, with the exceptions of folks like you who've spent their entire career thinking about the problem. And to Lourdes' question, we're now catching up. And so I think the industry is starting to build more interesting tools to solve those issues.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen the DevSecOps, and now we're really excited about, DevPrivOps and those suite of tools that are being built for developers, and we're trying to solve for engineering problems. And so, Killian, that's really exciting that you guys are coming up with or building some of those solutions. So we'll keep an eye out for what you guys have in store for us in the coming months as you prepare to announce and show us what you have. So I want to dig in and jump into solving privacy problems further. I mean, the rise of privacy tech, we broadly define privacy tech as tech solutions or tech tools that solve for privacy problems. And this is not to say that all privacy problems are solvable through tech. There are some things like legitimate, legitimate interests that are purely legal constructs and not something that a tech solution could solve for, but it's safe to say that many of our privacy problems, given many of them are created through technology, are also solvable through technology. Leah, what are some of the top privacy problems you're grappling with, for which you wish, if you could wave a wand, for which you wish there was a privacy tech solution, and maybe Killian can build in response to that in the coming months?
Okay, so one of the things that I have not seen a solution on the market that I am happy with, and it's possible I'm missing something, but my bar is high, so is data access interfaces. Me and one person on my team used to manage 10% of the internal groups at Google. We managed a huge percentage of Google's data very much ourselves, so we got to go find out the hard way all of the things that you want in there. We tend to have workflows that are very clunky. We tend to have workflows that are very particular person oriented, as opposed to saying, I know what your team does. Your team should have access to this. And there are two reasons to do that. One of them is I only want humans making the decisions that humans have to make, and they need the right information, the right place, at the right time to make those decisions. But also, when people change out of teams, you can clean it up. You can look at things and say, like, you're not using this data, you're not using this anymore. Let's clean that up. I also want to be able to enforce policies on there, like your interns can't have access to the user data, right? I don't want to have to try and solve that over all the time. And there's a whole life cycle to how you roll out a policy like that. You have print and tell me what happens if I'm going to do this. Then you have test where you will go and you start like warning people when that happens, and then you will actually deploy and enforce it. There are a lot of things in there. Like right now in these interfaces, you tend to go, well, would you like to put Lourdes in this group? What happens when I put you in the group? What happens if I take you out of the group, right? do I even know? Am I about to take something that's going to take my production systems down? That's one of the hardest things about removing access is you don't know if you're going to take down production without this. So there's all of these things in there, and there's things in there that are a little non-obvious. So for example, if I want to answer the question, what does Killian have access to? I need to have all of the access control lists, all of the things that control whether somebody has access to something. They all have to be able to be reverse indexable. I have to be able to not just say, allow these people, deny these people. I can't do that because I need to be able to answer the reverse question, which is, does Killian have access to this without actually running through the whole policy? I clearly have a lot of feelings about this and I've spent way too much time thinking about it, but it's something that I haven't seen a good answer for. Right now, everybody who really cares about this has to build their own. And unlike, it is a little, I think it's something that would be a little bit easier to plug into different companies than some of the other things where, like, Killian's working with some incredibly heterogeneous systems, which are pretty hard. So that is a thing that I really wish were on the market right now.
Yeah, access, like you're saying, Leah, access management is one of those tricky things that I'm curious if Killian, if that's one of the things that you're solving for, and if not, my follow-up question would be, if you're at liberty to share at this time, what are you solving for? What types of privacy problems are you guys solving for? I do recognize your response earlier that you're trying to solve for developers problems in the privacy area, but if you're at liberty to share at this time, we'd love to hear about what those problems are.
Happy to, and I suppose to build on what Leah has covered is a really important point. Like, I would argue that the end goal that we have set out is to achieve things like fine-grained enforcement in a sort of vast distributed system. The challenge in getting there, at least the way we're thinking about it, and that's why I'd love to compare notes with Leah more often, but the challenge in the way we're thinking about it is that in order to have sort of service level enforcement for an individual user, so an individual record across distributed systems, and ensure that sort of services can respect the rights of that individual or that record, requires access control systems that are far finer grained than the sort of coarse access control that existed in sort of infrastructure level RBACs of the last 2 decades. So now you're like designing very fine grained access control models around individual users. And so it's like a many to one to many relationship, right? There's the many services that might have access to that information, there's the single record, and there's the policies that are enforced by that individual, the consents that they provide for their data. And so you got to enforce those in sort of several dimensions. So the area that we've started to try and get there, because we think it's a journey of tools we need to build, is the first thing is to provide engineers with a way to describe context in a privacy syntax for what their services do. So tell me what business purpose your services can perform so that I can start to enforce policies on those for individual users' records, right? So if we have greater context across the sort of service mesh, we can start to enforce that at the service level. So that's where we started. So the first thing to answer your question, Lord, is tools for engineers to describe what their product does or what their services and tools do, and what categories of personal information they touch. So that results in having a sort of well understood taxonomy for personal data, and that's already difficult because the industry doesn't necessarily align on that. A strong understanding or an opinionated view on categories of processing, so how data is processed in systems that tries to align in some way with governance and policy. So we started with that, and that will then feed into the metadata layer that we provide for an organization to understand what its services do, so that you can start to enforce policy at a very fine grained level. So we're in a walk phase. Those are the first tools that we're building, and they're pretty exciting ones for us right now.
One thing I want to point out that is maybe not obvious to those of us who haven't built this sort of thing. There are two major chunks there's like two major categories of systems, online and offline. So like things where you're getting live user traffic and you need to answer it and you're responding to that user. And then all of your analytics, all of your ML pipelines, all of the stuff that you do to maintain all of your databases, things like that, all of that is offline processing. And those tend to look really different. And it's very hard to get solutions that cover both of those because they have, one of them is extremely latency sensitive and the other one is very throughput sensitive. And so you tend to end up with extremely different architectures. Oh, another thing, I am tired of building data deletion systems. Right? I was very lucky to come to Twitter. People built one, but like the number of companies that I have talked to building a data deletion system is not a small number.
Mhm.
At PEPR this year, there was an entire session on how do you do data deletion. I think it's pretty likely that the easiest way for a lot of that stuff to happen is for cloud providers to do this and to offer it. But also, like, y'all have to be aware that when you do things like you use Postgres, when you tell it to delete something, it doesn't delete it. It's a database. It spent so much time trying not to delete things. And then you have to not just worry about when are you telling it to delete it, but you have to worry about what is your database flush characteristic look like and stuff like that. Like all of this is very, very deep engineering stuff.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things that keeps coming up, not just with practitioners leading up to GDPR. Data deletion was one of the hot topics, right? How are we going to figure this out? And even colleagues in big tech that I spoke with were just like, how on earth are we going to try to solve this? And now that I speak with more and more privacy tech founders, when they start developing solutions and they they start talking about data deletion, and I'm like, oh, finally, you have a solution for this. And they're like, actually, we don't. It's something that we're building towards but haven't figured out quite yet, because they're worried about the liability of mistakenly, deleting things. And also that it's a very complex solution to build for, because each enterprise, each company, each organization is different. And so there's that scalability challenge that comes up when you're building a tool that different types of organizations can use. Speaking of challenges, so we talk about scaling solutions for privacy tech solutions for different types of organizations. Another one that comes up to me that keeps coming up are just the different cross-functional customer personas and the different business models needed for privacy tech startups to succeed and compete with non-privacy tech business models. And so I'm curious, Killian, as as a founder building in this space, which of these are the top challenges you're experiencing in the emerging privacy tech landscape, and how are you guys at Ethica addressing them?
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it reflects the point that both of you have made variously about the life stage that we're in privacy, right? So if you go back through the brief history of the indindustry, it started with consultants in a sort of very traditional compliance focus, right? And that makes sense, right? Yeah, a checkboards, a checkboxes, clipboards, etc. And that evolves into the first generation of GRC tools, right? And that therefore is managed very much by the legal function. And not to denigrate lawyers in any way, it's a very important component of the entire process, right? However, the result is the current motion, if you're a privacy tech company, the current sales motion is very focused on the GRC team who are thinking about the risk of non-compliance. And there's often a dissonance between that and what it takes to actually build tools operationally in a business that actually mitigate this. So it's one thing to provide a dashboard that says we deleted some data. It's very different to provide the tooling that actually orchestrates a deletion, for example, or rights management, for example, or enforcement. And so I would say if you look at the customer profile, it's still probably predominantly weighted towards the GRC function, because they're the ones that feel it most acutely, the pain today of the risk of non-compliance. But even in the 3 years that we've existed, that has shifted very quickly towards being an engineering focus, because as Leah already has demonstrated, it's increasingly a pressure on engineering teams to solve these problems. And they are very difficult problems that are under considered in the design of systems. Often they only get considered when the horse is bolted, right? You've collected an enormous amount of data. You now have an intolerable risk. The legal team are shouting about it, and you can't put the horse back, right? Like it's done, like the issue exists. So then it becomes a data engineering issue, right? Like a problem of infrastructure and tooling, which is very different. And I think that's where we're seeing now. That's where our customers are.
Leah, I'm curious, when you get these emerging privacy tech startups approach you, what are some of the pitfalls that you see them struggle with the most, and where and how can they do better, in your opinion?
I see a number of them struggle with finding a problem to solve, right? A lot of them will start with, I can go and show you this data, which is not the same thing as solving a problem. And people would ideally like to pay for somebody to solve their problems rather than point out their problems. So that tends to be tricky. People have a massive underappreciation for the power of the false negative. They don't realize what they're not seeing in a system, and the stuff. And so like they'll say, oh, we can use our heuristics to identify all of your user data. And I'm like, how do you know you're not missing it? How are you evaluating that you're not missing that stuff? And increasingly people are having good answers to this. Originally, people did not have good answers to this. They were like, well, we checked all the things that are ML model flagged, which is different than like that's, you tend to miss that. They do struggle with business model, right? Like it's really tricky, as Killian points out. Like if you're trying to sell to the legal team doesn't have engineers. And so the things you can sell to them are pretty limited. Legal teams also tend to be fairly limited in their ability to actually tell whether you are selling a useful piece of engineering tech or frankly, BS. And so if you're trying to explain differential privacy to a legal team, it's going to be fairly difficult. I've spent a lot of time explaining differential privacy to lawyers. You know, they can get it, but like they don't necessarily understand that differential privacy is not a silver bullet. And they're like, okay, well, we're gonna give it to the engineers and they're going to make our problems stop. And then they don't realize things like you can't apply differential privacy to free text, right? It's not a thing it's just not a thing that happens. And so you end up with weird disconnects in there around problem solving and around how things actually work.
Those are really great points to make. And they're not just a set of privacy tech problems, right? Like in startup world, the first thing you're supposed to start with is solving a problem or building a solution to a specific problem, as opposed to pointing out problems that your customer might have. So that's a great point. Thank you for sharing that, Leah. You also touch upon the different customer personas and some solutions that we see out there. Try to build for all the customer personas. I think there is a market for tools for lawyers to make their jobs easier in this space, but I don't think those are the same tools that the engineering and GRC teams are going to need to solve their own set of privacy problems. I do want to dig deeper into the business model issue. And I think it's less of a concern in the B2B space, given many companies are willing to pay for these solutions, and maybe more of a concern in the consumer space when it comes to trying to sell privacy tools to consumers. What do you guys think about that? Like, how can we move the industry forward and try to compete with other tech companies whose business models might be data driven or data based on user data monetization? It's like I honestly don't have an answer, and I'm curious if you guys have thought about this and what are some of the things that Killian might have explored with some of the investors that you've talked to when it comes to coming up with the right business models for privacy tech startups like yours.
Yeah, well, happy to tell you what we've experienced so far, not to suggest that we've cracked it, right? Like it's a work in progress for sure. Right. I think for various problems in privacy, there are different sort of models for commercialization. So for the GRC tools that we offer, the ones that are more likely to help the sort of the legal function in managing things like a deletion request, etc., we've decided that volumes of data or quantity of requests don't make sense. It's more about the number of systems you're orchestrating, right? So you have a sort of a baseline understanding of how to model the cost, and it doesn't change with the volume of users, because the truth is a privacy request isn't predicated on the number of users, it's the amount of infrastructure you're orchestrating. So ours is based on the quantity of systems rather than the volume of data or a number of users. As it relates to the other part of our core business, the tools we've been quietly building for the last 2.5 years that I keep talking about, those developer tools, they're exactly that, right? So they're one part open source, And I think that's, from our perspective, culturally, we think that's very important because it's imperative that it becomes widely adopted. That's not just a commercial strategy. It's the only way that privacy becomes a greater part of the design decision in software development is if the tools are readily available so that engineers don't have excuses to avoid it. Not to suggest they avoid it, but it's easy to pass on this right now. And then from our perspective, some of those tools will become commercial, right? They are per seat per engineer for some of those, and some of those are sold as infrastructure layers, right? Like Leah mentioned the idea of having, data access interfaces that are more sophisticated. Those are packaged products, right? Or versions of packaged products.
Thank you for sharing that, Killian. Leah, what are some opportunities that you see, untapped opportunities that you see, that you wish the startups that are emerging are trying to build for? What are some of these emerging opportunities that you see that you'd love to see solutions for?
Apologies if there's yelling in the background.
No worries, we didn't hear.
Turns out I'm not alone in the house. So, like I said, the data access one is right up there.
And deletion.
Deletion is right up there. And I really mean full deletion systems that really understand things like databases are engineered so that they don't lose your stuff. So we actually need to consider things like, what is the database flush time? What are an ML pipeline tends to have multiple steps. An analytics pipeline tends to have multiple steps, and we start needing to account for things like the times that things go through there. If you're training your ML model based on logs, then you start saying, well, what are your log retention timelines? Does it become recombinant because you take the output of the model and put it back in the log? I haven't seen anybody be that sophisticated about it yet, but I may have missed something.
Most of them are front-end interfaces and don't really go, they're not full stack. I haven't seen any full stack solutions either.
Yeah, and appreciating the value of monitoring, right? And monitoring doesn't just mean making sure that the deletion system works correctly. It means actually checking, scanning the database and saying, does it work? The heuristics that folks are using to identify data, I think they're getting better, which is great. But some of the more obscure techniques, like using k-hyperlog to try and do heuristic joins between large data sets, are a little underappreciated. As many times as I keep telling people about it, Killian's heard me talk about k-hyperlog at least twice now, right? The techniques are getting better.
So when you say the techniques are getting better, it reminds me of one of the challenges that we're having, which is maturity of some of these solutions. And so, what else can we do? I mean, PEPR is here. We also put on the Rise of Privacy Tech to bring together privacy engineers that go to PEPR and founders like Killian and potential buyers and investors. There's so many great privacy enhancing technologies that we've had since maybe the 80s, 90s, but not all of them are gaining maturity. What are some of the ones that you think are ripe for introduction to commercial use that you're seeing? That you're seeing, oh, finally we've gained enough, we've matured these solutions enough that it's now ready to be introduced. I know you mentioned differential privacy is one of those. It's not a silver bullet though. So
it's not a silver bullet.
I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I think a lot of the infrastructure stuff is getting there, right? Like there's this we're getting to the point where we kind of understand how you build an architect a system for reliable data deletion. I think I'm very comfortable with what does it mean to have a good data access and management interface, and like what does that actually look like. There's a lot of things that are getting there. There's a lot of things which are definitely still coming, like auto sanitizing interfaces. policy-aware data processing frameworks are, those are the, I think that's going to be the next one. Access control, I think we're just about to start seeing, and I'm seeing folks start to build out what I would consider good semantic access control systems. I will admit that I'm a little biased because there's at least somebody who there's at least one company who's building out based on a design of mine. So that's, I like the semantics of it. There was a reason why I designed it that way. But I think we're going to see a lot of the infrastructure stuff, the stuff that's more, there's a lot of things that are very up in the air still. Like I have a lot of thoughts about how we can go and do things like measure where we are with users and because noticing consent, I don't think is a good framework. It's a legal framework we have, but I don't think it's a good framework from a product point of view. And I think there are some things that, there are some techniques that we are going to be able to develop, which are very, very bleeding edge right now. I think that'll, the stuff that's a little more user understanding based, I think that'll be another wave behind it.
Thank you for sharing that. And you're right, notice and consent, even from a legal perspective, is under criticism. We have Professor Woody Hartzog, who is a big critic of, consent and generally because of how we've designed our tools and rendered it illusory. So I agree with that last comment that you made. And so thank you for sharing those. So infrastructure and access. So Killian, in your opinion, what are some of the critical next steps that we need to make in the landscape to keep moving things forward? So we talked about how things have focused on compliance, GRC. I also mentioned some of the challenges about the cross-functional customer personas that we have. We were trying to help as much as we can with the rise of privacy tech by bringing together key players like you guys, the experts, the domain experts, the founders who are building, the investors who are investing. What are some of the things that you as a founder, have thought about and said, hey, we really need this. We really need to achieve this in order to move the field forward and continue with the rise of privacy tech in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So to be fair, some of this Leah has already been working on, and they've demonstrated that in the discussion we've had today with like the sort of focus of moving this from a compliance task, because I'm nervous to call this compliance, right? Like that's the frame through which we sell products, but it is about improving technology, like actually improving technology systems, software and data systems, right? And the reason I bring that up is that while I could sit here and like shill products, I actually don't want to. I think the work that PEPR does and that Laurie Craner is also doing at Carnegie Mellon, that's what we need to see more of. Like we basically need more engineers excited about working on these problems. And that therefore means the job of the Rise of Privacy Tech, of PEPR, is to create a community that cares enough to work on these problems, because they are really, really interesting. Aside from being really important, they are genuinely very interesting problems. So, the work that Leah is doing, is a huge example of that, I think, and the teams that they have had at both at Google and Twitter and others. So I would hope to see more engineers of that caliber doing this kind of work. That would be a big part for me. And hopefully if we can provide some tools, that would be awesome.
Thank you for that. Well, I don't see any audience questions, but folks are free to ask any if they have. We do have about 5 minutes left. If you have questions there, I just see folks comment about agreeing with some of the challenges that we've been sharing. If you guys have any advice for those who are trying to help in terms of building solutions or moving privacy innovation forward, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Obviously, join PEPR next year at the next conference. Like keep engaging with the rise of privacy tech and other startups and investors and experts who are trying to fuel privacy innovation. But if there was one takeaway that you could share with the audience, if they wanted to keep helping, we have a lot of lawyers who work on the policy and the regulations and in DC and in Brussels. But I think we need more people working with us to fuel privacy innovation. Leah and Killian, if you have any advice for those who want to keep getting involved, what would that be?
The first thing that I do when I work with a team who are building a product or a system is I figure out what it is that they actually care about. And I try to help them understand that they want to build a great system. I am there to help. Building a respectful system is necessary to building a great system. And so this is not a distraction. This isn't something that they have to take time out of their day to do. This is how they get better. And what I found with teams that I've worked with is they figure that out and they go, oh, we ended up with so much of a better product. We thought about all of those weird edge cases, both in how the systems fall over in weird ways, but also we think about the incredibly diverse set of users that we are interacting with, and we just made our product work better. We made our system work better, and like getting and helping teams to get to that point gets you into a place where you can help them solve their problems by making the systems more respectful and more privacy preserving. And like that is the first big hump that you need to get over.
I couldn't agree more about privacy engineering and respectful tech as part of product excellence. I think that's one of the beliefs that I personally hold, but even at the Rise of Privacy Tech, one of our core beliefs is that privacy engineering is part of product excellence, and more companies need to adopt this, to understand this and adopt this strategy. Killian, what about you? What are some of the advice that you could share, especially founders who are just coming up after you, in terms of trying to move the industry forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this will sound glib, and it's not meant to be, but it's the sort of the GRC part of the puzzle is being well served, and it's easy low hanging fruit to go after. But I'd ask people, mostly so that we get better tools for the industry, to focus on the problems that are less obvious and probably more painful from an engineering standpoint to solve, right? Like the things that aren't being asked for by legal teams, which are the things that Leah has mentioned, right? So, a very elegant semantic access control systems that can scale with, vast, whether it's a consent-driven, like an explicit consent-driven mechanism, or some future state of user preference management, right? Like those things need to exist, and they need to not create some sort of strange anachronistic legacy debt in 5 years' time if we get it wrong, right? So those are the types of technical problems that matter to us, and they are really difficult because they require unpicking, for large organizations, 10, 15 years of legacy technical debt, as well as building these tools on top of that to sustain it. So they're scary problems, but they're the ones that will be most valuable to our industry in the next decade as opposed to the last decade, right? So I'd be very focused on those as a starting point. And those are painful problems, right? Like they are like hard data engineering problems. So, but that makes them more interesting, I guess.
Right, that's a great point. And I think it somewhat tangentially answers one of the questions that we had about the huge privacy technical debt, mounting privacy technical debt that we've incurred throughout the decades and are just now trying to solve for. And I think that's where many of the startups have been dwelling. I mean, I do see some decentralized tech also emerging. And one of the questions was, how can we build privacy engineering to Web 3.0? And to me, I mean, all the developments in that space are super interesting, but there's so many problems, the mounting technical debt that we've incurred that are facing us right now that also need solving today. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about that if you're interested, if you're working in the Web 3.0 space, or if you've seen any interesting things come out of that. Otherwise, Leah or Killian, otherwise, we'll leave that to the blockchain sessions that we have. We have a couple of other ones coming up later today.
I was just going to say to Killian, Killian, you're right. This is super hard. And you know what? If it weren't hard, it wouldn't be fun.
No.
I totally agree. Agree.
Many of us.
We're lucky enough to work on really difficult problems. And I would, for me, like as software engineers, those are the things that make it interesting, right? Like that is what we all, I think, signed up for, right? So, and on the Web 3.0, I think I'll leave that from my perspective, leave that to the clever blockchain folks. I think it could, like, for what it's worth, on a very personal note, it could swing it in two very different directions, right? It has the possibility to unlock great opportunity, but it also exposes tremendous risk about, like, data on a ledger that can't be manipulated. So, like, there's two ways of looking at the benefits of that. And the other is that, like, the legacy debt issue, that's a decade of unpacking. Like, Web 3.0 doesn't suddenly unpack, like, the volume of infrastructure that's in society today. Like, we built that too quickly. That's going to take a long time to fix, I think.
Great point to end on. And we are unfortunately out of time, but if you guys have any, closing remarks that you would like to share before we end, please tell the audience where they can find you, or any lasting or closing remarks that you might want to share with them.
Unsurprisingly, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Leah Kistner. I've been a little busy with my new job, but usually I tweet about privacy engineering, security engineering, and generally respect-oriented topics.
And likewise, I'm just Killian on Twitter, and you'll find me talking about many of the same things, not at the same scale as Leah, because they get to work on, like, really big problems, which is awesome. So
thank you both so much, and thank you to everyone who tuned in with us today. And we have another session coming up soon. We have other networking sessions and panels coming up as well, including a session in blockchain, a couple of them. So if you want to ask those questions in those sessions, please do. Thanks, everyone. Take care.